In June 2005, a Dutch princess was born into bells, cameras, and official joy. The palace gave her a name, Alexia. On the gilded birth announcement, the black ink looked clean, almost ceremonial. Then the sound changed. Cheers faded into the dry rustle of old reports and inheritance papers, carrying the same name from another edge of the royal family. No DNA verdict arrived. No explanation of the name followed. That silence made the name heavier than celebration. In the gap where an answer should have stood, the old record opened again. Prince Bernhard was not only Queen Juliana's husband, he became one of the great engineers of his own public image. In the official version, he stood in uniform, medals bright against his chest, presenting himself as a man of service, action, and post-war duty. Those decorations gave the monarchy a useful story: courage, service, and a prince who had earned his place. That public version was crowded with respectable entries. He stood beside Juliana as the royal house searched for steadiness after war. He helped give shape to the World Wildlife Fund, attaching his name to conservation at an international level. He also helped build the Bilderberg Circle, where private power, diplomacy, business, and politics met behind closed doors. To supporters, this made him more than a consort. It made him an operator of rare reach. Bernhard knew how to move through rooms filled with statesmen. Charm was part of his equipment. So was timing. He could turn proximity to power into a public asset, and the Dutch monarchy benefited from the image. The official record framed him as energetic, worldly, and indispensable. Under that bright surface, however, another account kept waiting. Behind the polished monument, the darker record was never erased. It was reframed. The uncomfortable facts of his youth did not vanish. They were placed inside a story that made them survivable. In 1933, Bernhard had joined the Nazi Party, a fact later confirmed after decades of denial. That alone was enough to darken the clean, wartime image the monarchy preferred to preserve. But the monarchy did not present him as a man defined by those early affiliations. The colder photograph of a young German past could be pushed back by another frame. Bernhard, in wartime service, aligned with the Allied cause, flying under a different moral sky. The image changed from suspicion to redemption. The young man with a dangerous history became the prince who had served against the forces that once shadowed his biography. That was the real art. The past was not destroyed. It was disciplined. The old photograph could be damaged, but the record remained. What mattered was where the monarchy placed the photograph in the story. Bernhard's life became a lesson in framing. A stain can remain visible, yet lose some force if the next chapter is told loudly enough. The problem was not solved. It was made easier to live with. That is why Bernhard remained useful to the story, even when he was difficult to defend. A monarchy does not need every figure to be spotless. It needs the public to know which parts of a life should be placed in the foreground. The medals stayed visible. The service stayed visible. The unanswered material moved to the side, not gone, but quieter. That method would matter again. Private blood, public naming, and inherited silence would soon begin moving toward the same child. Then came the scandal that could not be softened by wartime romance. In 1976, the Lockheed bribery affair struck with enough force to damage almost any public figure beyond repair. Newspapers carried heavy black headlines. The accusation was not old youth, not wartime confusion, not a distant political mistake. It belonged to money, influence, and the machinery of modern power. Inside the royal system, the response became a model of containment. The court did not let the scandal consume the institution whole. Distance was created. Rank was adjusted. Military duties and public functions were removed or reduced, as though official distance could contain the damage. Behind closed doors, officials handled the visible punishment with steady faces and little excess emotion. Yet Bernhard did not disappear. He kept his title. He kept his place in the royal family. He was wounded, reduced, and marked, but not expelled from the structure that had carried him for decades. That balance was the key. The monarchy absorbed the impact, isolated the blast, and allowed time to do the rest. This was not full cleansing. It was managed distance. Responsibility did not receive a clean public reckoning, nor was it denied with total innocence. Instead, it was suspended in a carefully controlled middle space, where punishment existed but final moral closure did not. Bernhard survived because the institution around him knew how to make scandal administrable. By the end, he had left more than controversies behind. He had left a royal method. Dark material could be acknowledged without being fully opened. Damage could be contained without being resolved. Reputation could be rebuilt by deciding which version of the man received the stronger frame. Bernhard did not only leave scandals that shook the Dutch monarchy. He left a hardened tradition, history managed through organized silence. And only when his final breath was gone could voices at the edge of the record begin to press forward. In December 2004, funeral bells carried through The Hague after Prince Bernhard died at 93. The public saw the measured rituals of royal departure. Flags lowered, uniforms arranged, a convoy moving over wet stone under a Dutch sky. The car bearing his coffin rolled slowly through the rain, and the official story seemed to close with it. A prince had died. A chapter had been sealed. Yet death changes the balance around a secret. The man who had helped hold certain stories at the edge of the record could no longer answer, deny, charm, or intimidate. Beneath the polished ceremony, another space began to matter. The archive, the drawer, the private file that had survived outside the palace announcement. In that colder room, pale light fell across sealed folders as unfamiliar hands turned pages that had not been meant for public comfort. What personality once protected now had to survive on paper. That shift mattered. During life, court etiquette can soften a question before it reaches daylight. Deference still gathers around the living prince, especially one who knows how to charm, joke, and turn inquiry into personal loyalty. After death, that protection thins. The palace can still stay silent, but the old fear around the person weakens. Papers become easier to read. Old claims become easier to print. What had once sounded like gossip begins to sound like unfinished business. After Bernhard's burial, Dutch reporting began to revisit the margins of his life. Whispers that had once remained social knowledge started moving toward print. Names began to travel. Editors could write with caution and still change the air. The issue was no longer only the official prince. It was no longer only the wartime figure or the public consort. It was the people who had lived near his bloodline without being carried by royal language. Once the strongest living barrier was gone, those stories found a narrow opening. Among the papers and reports, one name began to stand out. Alexia. It appeared not as a title, not as part of a royal announcement, but in the colder vocabulary of private correspondence and press accounts. Typed lines in a legal file could be imagined under a hard desk lamp. The name was marked in red, as though the ink itself had forced a hidden question into view. Reports after Bernhard's death said he had acknowledged 2 illegitimate daughters. One of them was a woman named Alexia. Alexia was described as a French woman, while Alexia was reported to be older and living in the United States. The public record did not close the matter with a DNA verdict or a formal palace ceremony. That restraint matters. Absence of a formal seal, however, was not absence of consequence. It carried pressure. Still, the appearance of the name had power. It disturbed the neat surface of the model royal marriage without proving every claim made around it. A person of flesh and time seemed to stand at the fence of official memory, close enough to trouble the family story, yet outside the gate that grants public status. The name did not need certainty to become unsettling. It needed only timing, repetition, and the knowledge that the man who could speak from the center was gone. Faced with the reports, the palace followed the old reflex. It did not give the public a settled answer. It did not build a clear bridge toward recognition, nor did it provide a forceful denial that might have closed the matter. The institution left the question suspended, and suspension can be its own form of power. A spokesperson can stand at a lectern, papers aligned, mouth held tight against the pressure of shouted questions. Journalists reach forward with recorders and cameras, asking for the sentence that would turn rumor into fact or cut it away. The papers are gathered. The figure steps down. The room receives no confession, no family map, no official repair. Silence does the work. For the woman linked to the name, that silence was the hardest category. It did not erase her from every conversation, because the press had already opened the door. Yet it refused to place her inside the formal house of memory. She could be discussed in reports and files, but she was not placed inside the official family story in the way monarchies make a person publicly real. That is the cruelty of the unofficial position. A person can exist in journalism, private letters, and whispered family accounts, yet remain absent from the polished record that defines royal belonging. Some names become audible only after the one person with the authority to acknowledge them has fallen silent. The unnamed woman sank back toward shadow. Then the next royal announcement made the question harder to ignore. 6 months after Bernhard's funeral, the Dutch royal house offered the nation a different image. In June 2005, Crown Prince Willem-Alexander and Princess Máxima appeared before the cameras with their second daughter. Flashbulbs broke across their faces, turning a private birth into national ceremony. The child was wrapped, held, and presented inside the familiar language of royal joy. Everything about the moment asked the public to look forward. It pulled attention away from drawers, papers, and recent funerals. The staging was bright, but the name quietly carried a shadow. Then, Willem-Alexander spoke the name, Alexia Juliana Marcella Laurentien. The smile remained on his mouth as the official sound entered the record. For most viewers, it was a charming choice, polished by ceremony and carried by a newborn's innocence. For reporters who had followed the recent edges of Bernhard's story, the first name carried another charge. Born on June 26, 2005, Alexia Juliana Marcella Laurentien entered the Dutch royal house. She was the second daughter of Willem-Alexander and Máxima. She stood second in the line of succession after her older sister. Her name therefore moved into state memory, birth announcements, palace files, genealogies, and future history. That is why the timing mattered. Half a year had passed since Bernhard's death. Another Alexia had begun appearing near the margins of his reported private life. Now the name returned at the center of the dynasty. The coincidence may not prove intent. It still made the air change. What made the name heavier was not its sound. It was the lack of explanation placed around it. The official birth announcement looked orderly, expensive, and certain. Fine paper carried the child's full name with the clean authority of the court. A reader could move line by line, searching for the usual sentence that turns a royal name into safe public meaning. None arrived. Royal households often prepare meaning before the public can supply its own. A name may honor a grandmother, recall a monarch, flatter a foreign relation, or signal continuity with a previous generation. Those explanations are not decoration. They are shields. They tell the nation how to read the child before gossip has time to organize itself. For Alexia, that shield was missing. No official note explained why the name had been chosen. No neat family tradition was offered. No ceremonial tribute was packaged for the newspapers. The silence did not accuse anyone, and it did not prove a hidden dedication. But it did create a dangerous blank. In dynastic life, blank space rarely stays empty. The blank did not need to shout. It only had to sit beside the date, the recent funeral, and the reports still moving around Bernhard's private life. A royal name works like a public instruction. It tells people what to remember and how to place a child inside the national story. When that instruction is missing, timing begins to speak for itself. The palace may have intended nothing dramatic, but in monarchy, even an unexplained choice can become a room where old questions gather. Without guidance from the palace, the public could attach the name to timing, rumor, and recent memory. People did not have to believe a final conclusion to feel the pressure. The name had been released into a room where another meaning was already waiting. By refusing to frame it, the royal house allowed the question to survive inside the celebration itself. Royal names are not casual sounds. In old dynasties, they work like entries in a living archive. Leather-bound genealogies preserve them beyond affection. Beatrix, Juliana, Wilhelmina. Each name carries roots and precedent through the House of Orange. Handwritten lines connect generations as though blood had been trained into ink. Against that system, Alexia looked different. Before 2005, the name had no clear traditional standing in the House of Orange. It was not one of the ancestral names that explained itself on arrival. Its new position made it more visible, not less. A question mark seemed to hover above the entry as it was written into the family tree. That is why the choice cannot be treated as sound alone. Naming a princess is a public act. It records what a dynasty once remembered and what it is willing to leave unresolved. A name can honor, distract, absorb, or move an old question into the next generation. Whether the intention was innocent, private, or more complicated, the effect was clear. Alexia stood in official daylight while another unresolved Alexia remained near the edge of the record. The force of the mystery came from that imbalance. One name received rank, announcement, and succession. Another had circulated through reports and private correspondence without recognition from the palace. The court placed the same name at the center of the royal future. Then it offered no explanation to protect it. History tightened around a newborn child. To understand the coldness of that missing explanation, the story has to move inside the Dutch monarchy itself. The House of Orange-Nassau did not survive the 20th century by turning itself into a running public drama. Its strength came from the opposite instinct. It offered steadiness, constitutional seriousness, and a style of royal life that rarely asked for applause. The British monarchy often produced scenes that felt almost theatrical. Cars pursued by photographers, faces trapped behind glass, headlines chasing movement. The Dutch model preferred a quieter bargain. The contrast is clear. On one side, photographers surge after a royal car, every flash demanding reaction. On the other, Queen Juliana's carriage rolls slowly between rows of citizens standing almost still, heads lowered in quiet respect. That was not emptiness. It was a political language. The monarchy did not need constant drama because dignity itself had become part of its authority. It gave the nation few emotional fragments to tear apart. In return, the nation often granted the institution a presumption of seriousness. That presumption turned discretion into authority, and authority into a shield against interrogation. This made silence more powerful. When a royal house builds trust through restraint, refusal to explain can look less like evasion and more like discipline. The public becomes trained to read stillness as seriousness. Scandal, therefore, meets a harder surface. No obvious stage exists on which it can perform. No daily appetite is fed, so no daily answer is required. Boredom becomes armor, and the armor is stronger than it first appears. That armor mattered whenever Bernhard's history threatened to break through. The Dutch court did not always solve its crises by opening them to full daylight. It absorbed them. The institution knew how to create distance, slow the impact, and separate the damaged figure from the core of the throne. When the Lockheed affair erupted, the danger was not only personal, it touched the credibility of a monarchy built on steadiness. Inside that pressure, Juliana became the fixed point. Juliana became a bent but steady figure at the palace window. She held the crown in place while advisors moved behind closed doors with reports no ceremony could soften. Her burden was not spectacle. It was containment. The institution around her had to show that the scandal belonged to Bernhard without letting it become the monarchy itself. That distinction was the survival mechanism. The method was cold and effective. Functions could be removed. Distance could be announced. Rank could be adjusted around the wound. Yet the center held. Lockheed did not become a total institutional collapse because the palace gave it an administrative shape. The scandal was not denied into innocence, but it was not allowed to explode without boundary. That same habit shaped how other unresolved stories survived. Questions outside the official family line did not become a public battlefield because the palace never granted them one. Without a formal arena, they remained suspended near the edge of recognition. But an unexploded charge does not disappear. It waits. A dynasty can make unsettled history look calm for years, even decades, by wrapping it in ceremony, protocol, and careful distance. That is not the same as clearing it away. The Dutch monarchy proved skilled at making unfinished matters appear settled. It did not answer every question. It lowered the temperature until the public lost the habit of asking. Follow the line backward from Bernhard's portrait. The polished image hangs in bright light. framed by service, marriage, medals, and official memory. Then the view retreats through rooms where no one speaks. Corridors open into colder space. At the end sits a cradle, quiet, new, and innocent, while an old shadow reaches it from another generation. This is how dynastic history moves. Not always through declarations, but through objects, names, rooms, and inheritance. The cost is transferred forward. A question that was never answered does not die with the person who caused it. It waits for a later name, a later birth, a later announcement that seems harmless until the older record presses against it. Even innocence could inherit the pressure of omission. That is why the name Alexia did not fall onto blank paper. It entered a system already trained to bury whispers beneath red carpets, polished statements, and the disciplined quiet of the House of Orange-Nassau. But the child's burden did not come from one side alone. Across the ocean, another family history was already waiting. Before Maxima became a princess admired by the Dutch public, she had to cross the political past attached to her father. Jorge Zorreguieta had served as Secretary of Agriculture under Argentina's military government during the 1970s. That fact did not sit quietly in a footnote. It stood beside her engagement like a second announcement, colder than romance and harder to stage. A European court could welcome the daughter. It could not ignore the office her father had once held. The problem followed her anyway. The images pull in opposite directions. Zorreguieta appears in a dark suit, composed and official, moving through the language of government. Beside that image are mothers holding photographs, their faces strained by the search for children who did not come home. The dictatorship has long been associated with up to 30,000 people killed or disappeared. Zorreguieta was not accused here of personally carrying out the violence, but he had held office inside the governing structure while those unexplained departures became part of Argentina's national wound. That made his past impossible to rinse clean with royal ceremony. A wedding could bring music, lace, and public affection. It could not turn a senior official into a harmless parent without consequence. Máxima entered the Dutch story, carrying a family history no tiara could neutralize. Before she could belong to the House of Orange, the court had to decide what to do with the man who had given her his name. The answer came in 2002 with a decision that cut straight into the wedding day. Jorge Zorreguieta would not attend. The royal house needed the marriage to appear politically bearable before the nation. His presence risked pulling Argentina's military past into the church aisle. So the father of the bride was kept away from the ceremony that should have placed him near the center. The bride could enter royalty. Her father could not enter the frame. The cruelty of that compromise showed on Maxima's face. In her wedding dress, under the weight of music and protocol, she held her mouth tight. When the sad tango rose through the church, a tear moved down her cheek. The image became unforgettable because it needed no explanation. The empty space where family should have been was not a mistake of seating. It was a political absence made visible before a watching nation. The seat spoke louder than any official statement, and the wound stayed visibly open. The crown did not ask Maxima to deny her father in private. It demanded something more controlled. She could love him, but he could not stand beside her on the day she entered the dynasty. Blood remained. Public recognition was withheld. That was the bargain. To protect the royal image, the court separated daughter from father before the cameras. The price of entry was not paid in money or jewels. It was paid in absence. That absence taught the Dutch public something about the price of royal acceptance. The monarchy could welcome Máxima as a person while still limiting the history that came with her. It could celebrate love and still draw a hard line around political memory. That was the tension Alexia would inherit from her mother's side. Affection allowed, but recognition controlled. Family present in the heart, but edited at the edge of the official picture. 3 years later, Princess Alexia was born at the meeting point of two unsettled histories. From her father's side came Bernhard, the great-grandfather surrounded by records that had never been written into a clean final account. From her mother's side came Zorregieta, the grandfather barred from the most sacred ceremony of his daughter's public life. The cradle stood between two different silences. One came from things not fully recorded. The other came from a man kept outside the door. The infant lay inside a royal nursery, while the family past gathered around the edges. On one side are files, reported illegitimate daughters, political management, and the old skill of leaving questions unanswered. On the other side is an excluded grandfather whose history could not be made safe enough for the altar. Alexia did not understand any of this. A newborn does not choose the archive into which she arrives. That is what makes her position so stark. She did not create Bernhard's unresolved shadows or Zorregieta's public exclusion. She did not choose the timing or the archive around her. Yet her birth placed her where those older silences could meet. The name attached to her already carried pressure. The bloodlines around her carried more. Alexia was not the source of any guilt. She became the child born where older debts had been left unpaid and where power still had to answer who was allowed to exist in black ink on white paper. Some names enter history through light. Others survive in the margin, carried by reports, correspondence, and cautious phrasing. Place the two Alexias beside each other, and the question no longer needs a laboratory. It becomes visible as structure. One child lies in a gilded cradle, surrounded by flowers, fine fabrics, and the vocabulary of succession. The room around her already knows how to protect her name. Beside Princess Alexia's official image stands another figure. She is a woman named Alexia, described in posthumous reports as one of two illegitimate daughters Bernhard had acknowledged. The image is grainier, less certain, closer to streetlight than ceremony. She moves through an ordinary crowd without palace guards, without a title, without the machinery that turns a birth into national record. Her name exists, but not in the same way. That contrast is the wound. The film does not need to prove blood with science to expose the difference between recognition and exclusion. One Alexia was born into formal memory. The other, as posthumous reports described her, lived outside the gate where family language becomes official fact. Same syllables, different fate. The cruelty lies in the split itself. One name arrives wrapped in national certainty, while the other must rely on scraps, journalists, and cautious archives before kinship is publicly admitted. A royal child could become part of the state by announcement. Another reported daughter could remain a question mark, circling the palace wall without ever being allowed inside. For Princess Alexia, power supplied every form of confirmation. Her birth came with official language, public ceremony, title, and rank. The sound of gun salutes could roll across the sky as the state marked the arrival of a child who already belonged to the future. A uniformed official could read the sealed paper aloud, the red wax doing what centuries of monarchy had taught it to do: make a name into law. That is the force of succession. It does not ask the public to believe through rumor. It announces, records, and repeats until doubt has no place to stand. Alexia's name entered bulletins, palace files, genealogies, school books, and international news. It stood in the line after her older sister, not as gossip, not as possibility, but as constitutional fact. The official record made room for her before she could speak. Royal power is not only wealth or ceremony. Its sharper privilege is the ability to make existence official. A palace can take a newborn and surround her with proof before the child understands language. The announcement becomes a shield. The title becomes a frame. The line of succession becomes a corridor running forward through time. That protection is not sentimental. It is administrative and sacred at once. Once placed inside official memory, a royal child becomes difficult to erase. Her name is copied, indexed, translated, and preserved. Power writes her into history with ink that ordinary families never receive. That is the cruel brightness of dynastic recognition. It makes one life undeniable. The opposite side of power is colder. It does not always destroy a person. Sometimes it leaves that person outside the room where recognition is made. For those not acknowledged, history offers weaker materials: newspaper scraps, legal correspondence, private letters, rumors repeated in cafes, and sentences phrased with caution. No red wax, no salute, no official page clearing a place. Cheap printouts, crossed-out lines, and typed claims sit without a royal seal. A name appears, then retreats into conditional language: alleged, reported, described, said to be. These words are necessary because the record has not been closed, but they also show the poverty of unofficial existence. A person can be discussed and still not be admitted. She can be near blood and still outside memory. This is how power distributes secrets. It decides which version of a family is carried by ceremony and which version must survive through journalism and oral history. It decides who receives genealogy and who receives speculation. The palace does not only hide, it decides which version of a family becomes official. For the Alexia in the dark, the punishment was not physical erasure. It was historical thinness. She was allowed to exist only as a contested outline near the royal story. That is the hardest authority of dynastic power. It is not only the power to bury truth, it is the power to decide who may stand cleanly in human memory. And the weight of that distribution would fall on a young woman who had taken part in none of it. Princess Alexia was never the source of any royal tragedy. She arrived after the decisions, after the scandals, after the silences had already hardened into inheritance. Images of her in early adulthood show a polished young woman moving through public life with trained composure. The surface is bright, hair set, shoulders straight, photographers waiting for a harmless smile. Yet every frame carries a history she did not create. Bernhard's Nazi Party membership, the Lockheed affair, and Zorregieta's political past belonged to earlier generations. She did not choose the questions that now pull those histories into the same room. That is the central injustice. A princess inherits more than diamonds, titles, and state ceremonies. She also inherits the refuse left by the dynasty that formed her. The historical stains belong to earlier generations, but rank makes inheritance total. Alexia's innocence does not free her from the structure. it only makes the burden harder to watch. The crown does not ask whether the child is ready. It hands over the whole archive. That archive arrives before she can form a public defense. Growing up under that structure teaches caution early. Public appearances around Alexia often carry the discipline of a generation trained to give the press almost nothing loose. At state events, her smile appears correct, warm enough for the cameras, distant enough to protect the person behind it. Her eyes move carefully through the room. Her posture stays measured. No careless gesture is allowed to become tomorrow's headline. That restraint is not emptiness. It is survival inside a family where names already attract interpretation. Unlike rebellious princesses turned into tabloid characters elsewhere, Alexia's public profile has remained tightly managed. Her education, appearances, and statements have been kept within narrow boundaries. The record made available around her is quiet by design. The fewer fragments the public receives, the fewer weapons the public can sharpen against her. This is the lesson younger dynasties learn from older damage. Silence can look cold, but exposure can be harsher. A single, unguarded sentence could invite every buried question back into the room. A casual photograph could be pulled into the old pattern of speculation. So the safest performance becomes control. Speak little. Appear when required. Smile without surrendering too much. Let the institution absorb the noise before it reaches the individual. Every controlled appearance becomes part of that defensive grammar. Alexia therefore stands in public with a strange double role. She is not responsible for the past, yet she must move as if the past is always nearby, waiting to attach itself to her smallest motion. Modern monarchy turns even distance into data. A school choice, a photograph, a short appearance beside her parents, even a silence can be treated as material for interpretation. This is not because Alexia has done anything wrong. It is because royal families live inside a public archive that keeps expanding while pretending to be neutral. Every new image lands on top of older documents. Every harmless detail can be pulled back toward a question the adults never closed. Some princesses inherit jewels and ceremonial roles. Others are placed in front of questions their families never answered. Alexia belongs to the second kind of story. The weight around her is not personal guilt. It is symbolic pressure. Her name, rank, and family history make her a living screen onto which older questions are projected. That is a lonely function for a young person who did not write any of the files. She walks down a long palace corridor under portraits of Orange Nassau ancestors. Their painted faces look down with the authority of people already secured by history. The walls seem to carry names that have been explained, honored, and protected for generations. Beneath them moves a princess whose own name arrived with an unanswered echo. The shadow does not need to shout. It only has to follow, lengthening with each step across the polished floor. Her youth is held inside questions adults refuse to settle. Bernhard's unresolved margins, the silence around unofficial blood, the painful absence in Maxima's family history. None of these began with Alexia. Yet the structure gathers them around her, because dynasties rarely leave their children untouched by old debts. She walks on red carpets, but under each step lies a murmur from the unfinished past. The sound is not accusation against her. It is evidence of a house still storing what it never repaired, not by her. And that murmur leads to the cruelest question the palace still owes the world. Prince Bernhard carried 2 ledgers into the marble silence of the Nieuwe Kerk in Delft. One ledger was carved in stone: titles, honors, wartime service, marriage to Juliana, and the public life of a prince the nation had learned to recognize. The white tomb closed over the official version first. Around it, however, colder fragments kept moving. Tabloid pages, old reports, and the dust of private questions drifted outside the official inscription like papers caught in winter air. Bernhard died with the state's honors intact, but not with every account settled. The public record could name what he had been allowed to remain. It could not reconcile every moral debt, every hidden margin, or every possible bloodline left outside the family language. The stone closed. The account did not close, because prestige can cover a grave without settling what it leaves behind. Beyond the palace frame, other lives moved toward quieter endings. Jorge Zorreguieta died in 2017, far from the full ceremonial light that had once surrounded his daughter Máxima. His absence from her royal wedding had already marked the price of entry into the House of Orange. He had been her father, yet the political past attached to his office kept him outside the image the monarchy needed to present. That exclusion did not vanish when the music stopped. It followed him to the edge of royal memory. Then there is the other Alexia, the woman described in posthumous reports as one of the illegitimate daughters Bernhard had acknowledged. The record does not give gossip the clean proof it wants. It does not give a DNA verdict, a palace ceremony, or a closed answer. Even after those reports, her life remained outside the formal royal line, walking through ordinary streets while another version of the name lived under title and succession. She would have existed in the thinner materials of memory: journalism, typed letters, oral fragments, and the uneasy patience of people who wait for recognition that never comes. These are not grand exits. They are the slow movement of people left beyond the gate. In front of that unfinished record, the Dutch palace remains controlled and almost unreadable. No final explanation has arrived. No official sentence has turned the loose threads into one accepted history. Gates remain shut, locks hold, and the institution keeps the privilege that monarchies guard most closely: the right to decide when silence becomes policy. That silence is not empty. It is a structure. It protects the center by making the edges carry uncertainty. Máxima's public composure, the palace walls, the sealed archives, and the careful phrasing around old claims all point toward the same method. The truth cannot easily cross a threshold built from rank, protocol, and inherited pride. So the question remains outside. Official memory refuses to open the door. The family continues under lights that never reach the margins or answer the waiting names. Princess Alexia continues forward with the name she did not choose. In a dark hall, her reflection stands before a mirror that makes one life look too small for the burden around it. Behind the glass gather blurred faces from older histories, each one asking for a place in the record. The name Alexia is not only a royal ornament. It shows how dynastic power works. Dynasties do not merely inherit history. They decide whose name is printed cleanly in announcements and whose name is left outside the official record.